Have you ever trusted someone who seemed harmless simply because of their age? Have you ever believed a polite smile, a steady voice, or a friendly reputation without wondering what might be hiding behind it? And what if the person you trusted wasn't just lying to you, but quietly studying you, learning your fears, understanding your routines, and preparing to use every detail of your trust as a weapon? These questions sat heavily over an entire community when the truth about 17-year-old Patrick McVeigh began to surface, a teenager whose polished charm fooled neighbors, teachers, investors, and even the family of the woman he would eventually destroy. People saw him as gifted, bright, almost too mature for his age, a young man who spoke of ambition and innovation like he had already lived a full life. But beneath the warmth of his carefully practiced personality sat a coldness that did not match his youth, a hunger for admiration that grew sharper each time someone believed his lies. Philadelphia is a city built on loyalty, hard work, and a demand for authenticity, and yet even this tough, skeptical community was disarmed by Patrick's soft-spoken confidence. He played the role of the promising tech partner, the trustworthy friend, the calm voice in a chaotic world, while slowly constructing a life made entirely of illusion. What no one knew then was that he had been rewriting his own identity long before the murder happened. He rehearsed emotions the way other teenagers rehearsed speeches, copying empathy like a script he needed to memorize. People found him impressive. Investigators later found him terrifying. And at the center of his web of charm and deception stood Ella, a young entrepreneur who believed she had found a brilliant partner and loyal friend, unaware that she was about to walk into a nightmare crafted by someone who viewed her not as a human being, but as a resource he could drain and discard when necessary. And the first sign that something was terribly wrong didn't come from Patrick at all. It came from the silent, chilling emptiness inside Ella's home, where everything looked too perfect, too undisturbed, and too deliberate, almost as if the killer wanted investigators to admire the cleanliness of his work. It began on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the city feels heavier than usual, as if something unspoken is brewing beneath the surface. Philadelphia is a place where people don't scare easily, a city hardened by decades of grit, blue-collar struggle, and a culture that values honesty above polished charm, which is exactly why what happened inside Ella's row house felt so wrong, so unnervingly out of place. When her father unlocked the door, he wasn't preparing himself for tragedy. He was preparing to scold his daughter for ignoring his calls. But the moment he stepped inside, the air itself felt colder, sharper, almost staged. There were no signs of panic, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, nothing that matched the chaos of a violent crime. Instead, the house looked painfully normal, too normal, the kind of stillness that makes a person's stomach tighten because something is off, even if the eyes can't immediately see it. In a city where violence usually leaves noise and destruction behind, this scene had the silence of a calculated decision. Investigators would later say it looked like the work of someone who didn't just want to kill, but wanted to erase the idea of a struggle altogether. As police officers walked through the home, they felt the eerie weight of someone who had taken their time, someone who didn't panic, someone who moved with a calmness that didn't fit the brutality of the crime. Patrick was the one who called the police pretending to be worried about Ella, pretending to be a friend checking in after missed messages, performing grief with the same precision he performed charm. His voice trembled in all the right places. His concern sounded almost poetic, but detectives noticed what ordinary people didn't: the timing of the call, the details he volunteered too quickly, the way his sadness felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced it in a mirror long before dialing. And while the neighborhood whispered about tragedy, detectives were already whispering something far more chilling, because the only thing scarier than a killer who leaves a mess is a killer who leaves nothing at all. From the outside, Patrick looked like the kind of teenager people admired without hesitation, polite, articulate, strangely confident for his age, the sort of young man teachers described as ahead of his time. He carried himself with a calmness that made adults trust him and made people his age envy him, but that calm was not the calm of a good heart. It was the calm of someone who learned, very early, how to copy emotions he did not feel. He knew when to smile, when to lower his eyes, when to soften his voice, and when to look wounded, each gesture carefully placed like pieces in a performance he never stopped rehearsing. With Ella, he played the role of the brilliant partner, praising her work while secretly draining the resources she believed were safe. With investors, he played the visionary boy genius, selling dreams he had no intention of building. And with neighbors, he played the polite suburban kid, the one who carried groceries for older residents and complimented people just enough to seem thoughtful. But beneath all of those masks sat a mind engineered for manipulation. He didn't just lie, he studied the effect of each lie, adjusted his tone, sharpened his delivery, and refined his stories until they became airtight. That was what made him dangerous. Not the lies themselves, but the precision with which he constructed them. Detectives would later describe him as a teenager who never made a natural emotional mistake. Every expression was too clean, too controlled, too perfectly timed. Even his grief over Ella's death sounded like it had been downloaded from a script. People around him didn't see a predator, they saw potential, and that belief gave him access to places and people he should never have been close to. Ella trusted him because he made her feel seen. Investors trusted him because he made them feel smart. Everyone trusted him because he understood exactly what people wanted to hear, and he delivered it with a sincerity that felt almost flawless. But the first real fracture in Patrick's carefully polished act came from something money couldn't hide, a financial trail so thin, so quietly draining, that detectives instantly knew they weren't dealing with a grieving partner, but with someone who had been preparing for this long before the police ever knocked on his door. From the very beginning, their small tech startup looked like the kind of uplifting story people loved to believe in. Two young minds, one brilliant with code and one gifted with persuasion, teaming up to chase a dream bigger than their age. Ella brought the heart years of careful saving, a modest inheritance, and a belief that talent and hard work could open doors that background and money couldn't. Patrick brought the shine, the polished confidence, the marketing talent, the smooth presentations that convinced investors they were witnessing the birth of a future business icon. To the outside world, the partnership looked balanced, inspiring, even wholesome. But behind the closed doors of their growing venture, Patrick was slowly rewriting the script, shifting responsibilities, claiming authority over the finances, and convincing Ella that he simply understood the business side better. He framed it as teamwork, but it was quiet domination. Each move was small enough that Ella didn't see the pattern forming around her, the late explanations, the vague excuses, the charming reassurances that sounded professional but meant nothing. He treated the company account like a private reservoir, dipping into it with the kind of casual entitlement only someone without guilt could possess. And each time Ella tried to ask a question, Patrick met her with a wounded expression, suggesting she didn't trust him, that she was overreacting, that she was complicating things that were supposedly under control. He gaslit her gently, consistently, almost artfully, using her kind nature against her. Meanwhile, the city around them, a place that celebrates hustlers and grinders, saw Patrick as a rising star. He had the charisma. He had the pitch, and he had Ella standing beside him as living proof of his credibility. What no one realized was that he wasn't building a company. He was building an escape route, one transaction at a time. And the first real clue that something was deeply wrong didn't come from a missing check or a suspicious withdrawal. It came from Ella herself, in a series of quiet, worried messages that no one noticed until it was too late. Messages that would soon reveal the beginning of a financial betrayal, far colder than anyone imagined. When detectives arrived at Ella's home, they expected the usual signs of violence, the panic, the struggle, the chaos that nearly always follows a crime born out of fear or desperation. But what greeted them instead was a silence so controlled it felt staged, a stillness that didn't match the brutal reality they would soon uncover. The furniture was untouched, the dishes neatly stacked, everything resting exactly where Ella had last left it, as if time had simply stopped inside those walls. It was the kind of eerie calm that immediately makes investigators exchange quiet glances, the kind of scene that suggests not an impulsive act, but a calculated one. There were no overturned chairs, no hurried exits, no defensive wounds visible at first glance, nothing to indicate a struggle had even occurred, and that was what chilled them most. Someone had ended her life with such precision and control that the crime scene looked more like a photograph than a place where a human being had breathed her last breath. Her father, who had discovered her moments earlier, stood outside in shock, unable to understand how a space that once felt warm could now feel like a perfectly arranged tomb. Patrick, meanwhile, had already placed himself into the narrative, calling the police with a voice full of crafted panic, rehearsed trembles, and carefully chosen words meant to position himself as concerned rather than connected. He talked about missed texts, about being worried for her safety, about deadlines and meetings they had coming up, details he slipped in effortlessly, as if grief had sharpened his memory instead of clouding it. But detectives noticed things most people would miss: how he volunteered certain information before being asked, how his sadness seemed timed rather than spontaneous, how his concern felt like performance rather than pain. And in a crime scene defined by unsettling quietness, his voice sounded just a little too polished. But the silence inside Ella's home wasn't the only thing that felt rehearsed, because once investigators opened her financial records, they found a different kind of crime scene, one where the violence wasn't physical, but financial, methodical, and far more revealing than any fingerprint on a wall. When investigators shifted their attention from Ella's home to the financial records of her startup, They expected to find the usual mistakes young entrepreneurs make: messy bookkeeping, confusion, maybe poorly tracked expenses. But what they uncovered instead was a quiet, steady bleeding of money that didn't look accidental at all. It looked intentional, it looked practiced, and worst of all, it looked personal. The company account, which should have held more than $100,000 from their latest round of funding, was nearly empty. Not because of one large theft, but because of dozens of small, untraceable withdrawals spread out over months, each one so cleverly spaced that Ella never saw the pattern forming. The numbers didn't lie, and they didn't stutter. Someone had been draining her business from the inside, with the patience of a thief who believed he would never be caught. When detectives confronted Patrick with the early findings, he played the role almost too perfectly. His eyes widened at the mention of missing funds. His voice softened, full of concern, as he suggested that Ella might have had a hidden problem, maybe debt, maybe gambling, maybe something too painful for her to confess. It was a disgusting tactic, one that turned suspicion toward the victim, but he delivered it with such calm sincerity that a less experienced detective might have believed him. But Ella's family didn't. They brought forward emails and messages showing her growing frustration with Patrick's secrecy, gentle questions she had asked, red flags she had noticed, moments where her intuition had warned her something wasn't right. She wasn't reckless, she wasn't irresponsible. She was closing in on the truth, and that truth threatened the fantasy Patrick had built around himself. His confidence began to show cracks the moment detectives mentioned those messages, and they saw something flicker behind his expression, not fear of being accused, but fear of losing control of the story he had been crafting. And once investigators dug deeper into Patrick's spending habits, they realized the missing money wasn't the real shock. The real shock was what he had used it for, because the purchases revealed a double life so bold and so arrogant. It made them wonder if the murder was only the final chapter of a much darker plan. As investigators traced the missing money, they began to see the outline of a life that did not match the polite teenager everyone thought they knew. While Ella lived modestly, pouring every spare dollar into the company she believed would change both of their lives, Patrick was secretly living like someone who had already made it big, a life funded by her trust, her savings, and her belief in their shared dream. He ate at restaurants most adults couldn't afford, posted photos on private social accounts from expensive lounges in New York, wore sneakers that cost more than some people's rent, and drove a car that raised eyebrows in a neighborhood where ordinary people worked hard for every bill they paid. Yet to Ella, he complained constantly about being broke, asking for small amounts of cash, pretending he couldn't pay for lunch, acting like he was barely staying afloat. It was psychological cruelty disguised as financial struggle, a manipulation designed to keep her feeling responsible for him and guilty for questioning him. Worse, detectives discovered he had also taken out credit cards in her name, forging documents with a confidence that suggested this wasn't his first deception. Those cards funded even bigger purchases: a gaming setup, concert tickets, designer clothes, and expensive hotel stays he bragged about to friends under the lie that his parents were paying for everything. He treated Ella not as a friend or a partner, but as an invisible bank account with no limit and no voice. And as investigators pieced together this secret lifestyle, they felt the shift. This was no longer just a financial betrayal. It was the psychological profile of someone who saw people as tools, someone who fed off admiration, and someone who was preparing to do anything to protect the false world he had built. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't the spending itself. It was the encrypted folder detectives found next, a folder that turned a case of fraud into something far darker, because inside it were the early blueprints of a life Patrick intended to escape to, and why Ella could no longer be part of that future. When digital forensics experts unlocked the hidden encrypted folder on Patrick's laptop, they weren't expecting to find much more than receipts or maybe a stash of deleted messages. But what opened on their screens was not the carelessness of a teenager. It was the cold planning of someone preparing to erase his own identity and rebuild a new one without leaving a trace. Inside the folder was a multi-page document labeled harmlessly with a business-sounding title, but the moment investigators began reading, they felt the temperature in the room shift. It was a relocation plan, but not the kind a young entrepreneur makes after a new job opportunity. This was a blueprint for vanishing. Patrick had outlined step by step how he intended to drain the remaining company funds, convert assets into untraceable digital currency, obtain forged documents, and travel under a new identity through a series of countries with weak extradition laws. He had researched offshore banks, foreign SIM cards, dark web identity brokers, and remote hostels in Europe where no one would question a young traveler paying in cash. He even planned out the clothes he would wear to look unremarkable, the lies he would tell border agents, and the timeline he needed to follow to stay ahead of suspicion. But the coldest part wasn't the escape itself, it was the way he referred to Ella, not by her name, not even as a partner, but as the asset. In his planned timeline, her death was listed as Phase 1. Asset liquidation, written with the same detachment someone might use when shutting down a failing business account. It was a chilling, bureaucratic way to describe ending a human life, revealing a mind that didn't simply lack empathy, but had replaced it with an efficiency that frightened even the most seasoned detectives. And the deeper they read, the clearer it became that Ella's murder wasn't a sudden act of panic. It was the first step in a long, meticulously crafted exit strategy. But what investigators didn't know yet was that Patrick's escape plan wasn't fully original, because buried deeper in the digital folder was a list of names, a list of future assets he had been studying, a list that revealed Ella was never meant to be his last victim. Investigators had already suspected that Patrick was siphoning money, lying with ease, and performing grief like a polished actor, but nothing prepared them for what they found buried deep inside his laptop. An encrypted folder so heavily protected that even experienced forensic analysts needed hours to crack it. And when it finally opened, they discovered not panic, not regret, not even an attempt to justify what he had done. They found strategy. Cold, calculated, step-by-step strategy. Inside were documents detailing a future Patrick had designed long before Ella ever realized she was in danger. He had mapped out an escape with the precision of a corporate executive preparing a hostile takeover. Researched flight routes through smaller airports, planned how to spread stolen money across multiple digital wallets, and listed safe hotels in Europe where no one would ask questions if a young man paid in cash and avoided eye contact. He had instructions for himself, written in unemotional bullet points, about how to burn clothes, how to ditch electronics, how to answer border questions in a calm monotone. But the most horrifying part was not the preparation, it was the way he spoke about Ella. In the document, she wasn't a partner, a friend, or a human being. She was a line item in a larger plan. Her death was filed under risk removal, as if she were nothing more than a threat to the fantasy life he wanted to build overseas. It was the kind of language that strips a person of their humanity, the kind of phrasing only someone clinically detached from empathy could write. And as detectives scrolled further, they uncovered evidence that Patrick had already been practicing the persona he intended to adopt after disappearing. New names, new backgrounds, new hobbies, even new personality traits he wanted to mimic to blend in. It was clear he hadn't just planned to run, he had planned to become someone else entirely. But investigators were about to learn something even darker, because hidden beneath the escape blueprint was a second list, a list of people whose lives Patrick had quietly evaluated, studied, and measured, people who never realized they were being considered as his next target. As investigators continued digging through the encrypted files, they came across something far more disturbing than an escape plan, a list of names, neatly organized, each accompanied by notes that looked nothing like business documentation and everything like a predator evaluating prey. These individuals were not criminals, enemies, or strangers. They were young entrepreneurs, former classmates, and people Patrick had crossed paths with in tech meetups or casual business events. The notes beside each name read like a twisted checklist: financially stable, trusting personality, isolated family, naive with money, easily influenced. It was the kind of cold profiling that stripped people down to attributes, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities he could exploit. Detectives immediately recognized what the list represented. It was an evolving catalog of future opportunities, potential victims he believed he could charm, drain, and discard just as he had done to Ella. In Patrick's mind, relationships were transactions, and people were resources. Ella had simply been the first one he fully consumed. The pattern, once invisible, now glowed in neon. He sought out kindness, mistook it for weakness, and used it as a testing ground for manipulation. The fact that he had researched these individuals so deeply, their routines, their families, their emotional triggers, showed a chilling level of patience and long-term planning. And as detectives cross-referenced the names, an even more unsettling truth surfaced. One of the people on his list had vanished 2 years earlier, a young man named David, whose disappearance had been filed away as a runaway case. No motive, no evidence, no answers. Until now, suddenly the financial inconsistencies, the charisma, the rehearsed emotions, and the meticulous planning took on a new meaning. Patrick hadn't just killed once, he had learned from it, improved it, refined it, and Ella wasn't an isolated tragedy, she was part of a progression. But the breakthrough connecting Patrick to a potential earlier victim wasn't just theoretical, because investigators were about to uncover physical evidence, buried in a place no one expected, that tied Patrick directly to a second disappearance, and exposed the horrifying possibility that they were dealing with a serial predator still in the making. The turning point in the investigation didn't come from a confession or a witness. It came from something silent, something pulled from the trunk of Patrick's car, a simple shovel with soil packed deep into the grooves. At first, detectives thought it might be normal dirt from the neighborhood or a residue from some innocent task. But protocol required testing, and that decision opened the door to the most chilling discovery yet. When forensic geologists examined the soil composition, they immediately noticed it didn't match the environment around Ella's home, nor the suburban area where Patrick lived. The mineral content, moisture signatures, and microscopic organic traces pointed to a very specific location miles away, a location tied to an entirely different case. The lab cross-referenced the soil sample with data from unsolved crime scenes, and the match hit like a hammer. It was the same soil found at the shallow grave of a missing young man named David, a former business acquaintance of Patrick's who had vanished 2 years earlier. For months, David's disappearance had been labeled a runaway situation, no foul play suspected, no strong leads, and no clear motive. But now, in the trunk of Patrick McVeigh's car, was a shovel carrying the same earth that had once covered David's body. That soil became a silent witness, a physical link tying Patrick not only to Ella's death, but to a murder that predated hers. Detectives realized they were no longer pursuing a teenager who made one horrific decision. They were closing in on someone who had practiced killing. Someone who had tested methods, refined tactics, and grown bolder with each victim. As they revisited David's old case file, patterns jumped out with horrifying clarity. Financial exploitation, manipulation, sudden disappearance, all echoing what had happened to Ella. And for investigators, this soil wasn't just evidence. It was confirmation of something they had suspected in whispers but hadn't dared articulate aloud. Because if the soil tied Patrick to David's grave, then what investigators uncovered next would tie him to a future far darker, proving that Ella's murder wasn't an escalation. It was the continuation of a deadly pattern he had no intention of stopping. As detectives pulled back the layers of Patrick's life, they began to understand just how carefully he had crafted the version of himself that everyone else believed. He didn't simply act charming. He curated charm with the discipline of someone building a brand. To strangers, he was the polite young man who held doors open and complimented people with a practiced sincerity that felt genuine. To teachers, he was the gifted student who always had the right answer and the perfect tone. To friends, he was the guy who appeared confident and mature, someone who made you feel special just by talking to you. But behind all of that polish was a volatile emptiness, a deep-rooted sense of superiority that made him incapable of viewing other people as equals. Every relationship he formed was transactional, every compliment calculated, every gesture designed to earn trust he could later weaponize. Investigators noticed that when Patrick wasn't performing, when he didn't think anyone was watching, his expression shifted into something colder and disturbingly flat, like a person briefly removing a mask that had been glued on too tightly. His friends had dismissed these brief moments of detachment as stress or teenage moodiness, but detectives recognized the truth. Patrick wasn't changing moods, he was switching characters. He had studied human emotion the way a magician studies sleight-of-hand tricks, learning how to mimic sorrow, gratitude, worry, affection, using those emotions not to connect, but to manipulate. And Ella, with her optimism and trust, had become his perfect mirror, reflecting back the admiration he needed to maintain his illusion of brilliance. She had no idea she was dealing with someone who resented her talent even as he depended on it, someone who watched her kindness, not with appreciation, but with envy and growing hostility. Beneath the charm was a teenager filled with a quiet, simmering rage, a rage born from entitlement, greed, and the intoxicating belief that he was smarter than everyone around him. And that rage wouldn't stay hidden for long, because once investigators dug into the digital timeline of Ella's last days, they discovered messages and patterns proving she had unknowingly stepped onto a collision course with Patrick's darkest instincts, a confrontation that would seal her fate. In the weeks leading up to her death, Ella began noticing small inconsistencies around the company finances, numbers that didn't match, expenses she didn't recognize, and unexplained gaps Patrick always managed to smooth over with just enough charm to make her doubt her instincts. She wasn't suspicious by nature, but she was smart, and that intelligence quietly pushed her to ask gentle questions, the kind of questions Patrick hated. At first, he disarmed her with rehearsed frustration, claiming she didn't trust him, twisting her concern into guilt. But Ella had reached a point where her intuition refused to be quiet. She began saving screenshots, forwarding emails to herself, and writing notes about conversations that felt off. Her messages from that final week painted a heartbreaking picture. a woman trying to hold on to optimism while slowly realizing someone she admired was hiding something from her. She wrote to a friend that Patrick had become hard to read, that he was evasive, dismissive, strangely defensive about simple accounting questions. She even suggested meeting with him to go over the books together, an innocent request that, in hindsight, was the moment everything changed. Because while Ella was preparing to confront the truth, Patrick was preparing to silence it. He could feel her slipping out of his control, her questions getting sharper, her patience wearing thin. To someone like him, who relied on deception the way others relied on oxygen, Ella's growing awareness wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. She had become the only person who truly understood the company's financial structure, the only one capable of exposing his scheme, the only obstacle between him and the fantasy life he had been building in secret. And detectives later realized that the timing wasn't accidental. Ella died just days before the meeting she had planned to finally lay everything out in the open. She wasn't killed because Patrick panicked. She was killed because she was about to uncover the entire structure of his lies. And when investigators examined Patrick's behavior during those same final days, they found something even more chilling. Because while Ella was documenting the truth, Patrick was rehearsing his biggest lie yet, the lie he would tell the world after she was gone. While Ella spent her days budgeting carefully and dreaming about scaling their startup, Patrick lived a life that didn't match his age, his income, or his story, not even close. Investigators quickly learned that the missing funds hadn't vanished into thin air. They had been transformed into the props of a lifestyle Patrick, used to feed an ego that demanded admiration at any cost. He dined in high-end restaurants, where the bill equaled what Ella paid in rent, documented nights out in private lounges on a secret social account, and purchased designer clothes he never wore around her. Photos showed him lounging beside rooftop pools in New York, renting expensive cars for weekend getaways, and attending events where he pretended to be the young CEO of a fast-growing tech empire. Meanwhile, to Ella, he acted broke, asking for cash, claiming he was behind on bills, sighing dramatically about stress and hardship while siphoning her savings in the shadows. His manipulation wasn't just financial, it was emotional warfare, designed to keep her sympathetic, guilty, and too trusting to question him. When detectives reviewed the receipts, the pattern was unmistakable. Patrick stole small amounts to test the system, then larger ones once he realized Ella never confronted him aggressively. The money trail painted a portrait of someone living in two worlds, one where he played the hardworking teen founder, and another where he acted like a millionaire without earning a single dollar honestly. What made the deception even more sinister was how carefully he hid his extravagance from Ella, knowing she would recognize instantly that the company couldn't support such spending. And that duality, public humility, private indulgence, is what convinced investigators they weren't dealing with a panicked teenager, but with someone who had been preparing to step into a different life entirely, one he felt entitled to regardless of who he had to destroy. But the real proof of Patrick's cold intention wasn't in the clothes he bought or the meals he enjoyed. It was hidden deep inside a digital file investigators discovered next, a document revealing that Ella's murder wasn't a reaction. It was a necessary step in a master plan he had been perfecting for months. The deeper investigators went into the encrypted documents on Patrick's laptop, the clearer it became that Ella's death hadn't been a moment of panic or a confrontation gone wrong. It had been calculated long before she ever realized she was in danger. Hidden inside that digital folder was a chilling spreadsheet, sterile in layout yet monstrous in meaning, where Patrick broke down his entire plan like a corporate strategy. Every step had a timeline, every risk had an assigned mitigation, and every obstacle, including Ella, was listed as something to be removed. What shook investigators most wasn't the planning itself, but the language. He didn't refer to Ella by name, nor as a partner or a friend. She appeared only as the liability, a cold term normally reserved for failing assets or costly mistakes in a business ledger. Her death was labeled Phase 1. Liability resolution, positioned between notes about transferring funds, creating new identification profiles, and scouting international travel routes. It was the kind of language that strips a human being of dignity, turning a life into a problem to be solved. To Patrick, murder was simply an operational step, no different than sending an email or closing a bank account. He had even assigned a time window for it, calculating when Ella would be alone, when suspicion would be lowest, and when he could execute the crime without jeopardizing his escape plan. This wasn't an escalation, it was a blueprint. He intended to finish draining the company's finances immediately afterward, quietly transfer the remaining funds into digital wallets, then disappear under a new identity to begin the life he believed he deserved. And what horrified detectives even more was realizing how calm he had been throughout the process. The notes were free of emotion, free of hesitation, free of anything resembling humanity. It was the kind of document that forces investigators to see a suspect not as a troubled teenager, but as someone fundamentally incapable of empathy. But just when detectives thought they had uncovered the full extent of his cold planning, a new discovery shifted the case entirely. Because Patrick hadn't only planned Ella's death, he had already tested the method once before on someone else, refining his strategy long before the police ever knew his name. The discovery that truly shattered every remaining illusion about Patrick wasn't the stolen money, the fake persona, or even the blueprint for escape. It was what investigators found when they followed the digital breadcrumbs from his encrypted files and connected them to a missing person report that had quietly faded into cold case storage. 2 years before Ella's murder, a young man named David had disappeared without warning, a bright, aspiring entrepreneur who had briefly partnered with Patrick on a small project that never gained traction. At the time, David's disappearance had baffled police. No signs of struggle, no suspicious financial activity, and no clear motive. It was eventually labeled a probable runaway, the kind of case that slips out of public memory despite the pleas of the family left behind. But now, with Patrick's digital list of potential assets in hand, David's name appeared as the earliest entry, marked with notes that matched the same cold criteria Patrick later used to evaluate Ella. Detectives realized they were looking at a pattern, not an isolated event. When they cross-checked the soil from the shovel in Patrick's trunk with samples collected from the site where David's body had been discovered, the match was perfect, a physical link between two crimes separated by years, yet united by the same chilling signature. Suddenly, Patrick's evolution made horrifying sense. David had been his test run, the first victim who disappeared without suspicion, giving Patrick the confidence to refine his methods, improve his lies, and sharpen the mask he wore so convincingly. Ella wasn't just unfortunate, she was chosen. She was the next opportunity in a growing trail of exploitation and calculated harm, selected because Patrick believed she would be easy to control, easy to gaslight, and easy to erase. Investigators now knew they weren't just building a case against a manipulative teenager. They were standing face to face with a predator who had been learning, adapting, and growing bolder with every success. But even this horrifying revelation wasn't the final twist, because while detectives uncovered Patrick's past, he was already preparing a new performance for the future, one that would erupt inside the interrogation room and expose a level of arrogance so extreme. It would destroy any chance he had left of hiding what he truly was. When detectives eventually sat across from Patrick in the interrogation room, they expected fear, defensiveness, or at least the hesitant confusion typical of young suspects. Instead, they were met with something far more unsettling. A calm, calculating teenager who seemed to view the entire process as an intellectual exercise rather than a fight for his future. He leaned back in his chair like a man hosting his own interview, correcting detectives' phrasing, smiling condescendingly when they presented evidence, and shifting his lies with a smoothness that suggested endless rehearsal. Every time an inconsistency emerged, he abandoned the old story without hesitation and replaced it with a new one crafted on the spot. As if truth itself was a toy he could bend to fit whatever narrative benefited him in the moment. He spoke about Ella as if he were a victim too, a grieving partner blindsided by tragedy. He invented conversations, fabricated emotional moments, even described her secret problems with a tone of concern so polished it bordered on theatrical. But the detectives weren't fooled. They watched the subtle flickers in his expression, the microsecond of irritation when confronted with evidence, the flash of contempt when asked a direct question, the tightening of his jaw when he realized he couldn't outsmart the data. And when they presented the cell tower records placing him at Ella's home the night of her murder, his mask didn't crumble, it hardened. He didn't panic, he didn't crumble. He simply recalibrated, giving a new explanation as casually as if he were discussing the weather. It was the first time detectives realized they weren't dealing with someone nervous or confused. They were dealing with someone who felt genuinely superior, someone who believed the room belonged to him. And yet behind that manufactured confidence was a rising frustration, a silent rage that began to leak through the cracks as the evidence tightened around him. But his composure shattered completely when investigators unveiled a single photograph, an image that not only exposed his lies, but ignited a flash of pure hatred in his eyes, revealing the monster he had been hiding beneath layers of charm. The interrogation had become a psychological chess match, with Patrick treating every question as an opportunity to demonstrate his supposed brilliance. He shifted lies effortlessly, layered just enough emotion into his voice to seem believable, and acted offended whenever detectives hinted at suspicion. But all of that collapsed the moment they slid a single photograph across the table, an image captured by a neighbor's security camera showing Patrick's car parked on Ellis Street at the exact time he insisted he was miles away. The moment his eyes landed on the timestamp, something frightening happened. His expression didn't show fear, guilt, or even surprise. Instead, it hardened into a cold, venomous glare, the kind of look that stripped away every trace of charm he had spent years perfecting. For a split second, his true self surfaced, not the polished, articulate teenager people admired, but a predator enraged that someone had outsmarted him. He tried to recover, of course. He spun a new story, claiming he had lent the car to a friend he conveniently couldn't name, a friend who allegedly lived in fear of strict parents and begged for secrecy. The explanation was so absurd, so weak, that it highlighted just how cornered he felt. And yet he clung to it with a bizarre confidence, as if his sheer conviction could force reality to bend in his favor. Detectives watched him unravel in real time. His arrogance tightened into hostility, his calm softened into a barely contained fury. The polished mask he had worn through the entire interrogation was cracking, revealing a raw, childish rage beneath it, the rage of someone who had always believed himself untouchable. It became clear he wasn't reacting to the evidence itself. He was reacting to the humiliation of being confronted with something he couldn't manipulate or talk his way around. For Patrick, the photograph wasn't just proof of his presence, it was an insult to his perceived superiority. And detectives sensed that if a single photo could trigger such violent irritation, the next step in their strategy, presenting him with the full financial autopsy of his crimes, might finally push him into making the catastrophic mistake they had been waiting for. Detectives knew Patrick prided himself on being the smartest person in any room, so when they brought in the full financial audit, a thick stack of bank statements, forged signatures, credit card applications in Ella's name, and screenshots of his luxury purchases, they didn't just present evidence. They presented a direct attack on the fantasy world he believed he controlled. The moment they spread the documents across the table, his posture stiffened, his jaw flickered, and the rehearsed calm he had worn like armor began to melt. Each page was a mirror forcing him to look at the ugliness he never thought would surface. The auditors had traced every stolen dollar, the dinners that cost more than Ella's monthly grocery budget, the hotel stays disguised as business trips, the designer clothes purchased hours after he told Ella he couldn't afford lunch. They showed him the credit cards opened using her identity, the forged documents he had sloppily tried to disguise, and the digital trail of payments he thought he had hidden behind throwaway accounts. What unsettled him most was not the exposure of his lies, it was the fact that someone else had mapped his secret life better than he ever could. For the first time, the detectives watched him lose rhythm. His answers lost their polish. His voice thinned, his hands fidgeted, and each attempt to create a new excuse only tangled him deeper in contradictions. He tried blaming Ella, claiming she must have been confused, but the evidence showed transactions made while her phone was turned off or while she was verifiably elsewhere. He tried accusing investors, accusing banks, even inventing anonymous thieves, but the financial timeline aligned perfectly with his movements, his tastes, and his growing appetite for a lifestyle he never earned. As the documentation grew thicker on the table, so did the silence around him. His manipulation had thrived in ambiguity, but clarity was suffocating him. Detectives realized they weren't just breaking his lies, they were breaking the illusion of control he depended on to feel superior. And the moment they sensed his ego fracture, they prepared their final weapon, a piece of evidence so reckless, so shocking, and so revealing of his true nature. It would expose Patrick not just as a liar or a thief, but as someone willing to destroy himself rather than let anyone else narrate his story. Just when detectives believed Patrick couldn't surprise them anymore, he delivered the most reckless and revealing act of the entire investigation, an act so desperate that it instantly stripped away every layer of sophistication he had tried to hide behind. While reviewing evidence before trial, a guard performing a routine cell inspection discovered a 6-page handwritten letter Patrick had attempted to smuggle out of jail. It wasn't an apology, nor a plea for sympathy. It was a bragging monologue, a grotesque victory lap where he detailed what he had done with disturbing pride, mocking Ella, her family, and even the investigators who had tracked him down. The prosecution called it a written confession drenched in arrogance, the kind of document that destroys a defense before it even reaches a jury. But before it could be formally entered into evidence, Patrick made his move. During a pre-trial hearing, while waiting in a small holding room just off the courtroom, he asked a bailiff for a cup of water. As soon as the officer turned away, Patrick lunged for the evidence bag containing the letter, ripped it open with frantic hands, and began stuffing the pages into his mouth, chewing and swallowing as if consuming the words would rewind time and erase his guilt. It was a pathetic, animalistic scramble, nothing like the polished, calculated persona he projected. Guards rushed in, forcing his jaw open and pulling out the soggy, half-dissolved remains. But the damage was done, and not in the way Patrick hoped. Instead of hiding his guilt, he showcased it to the entire legal system, proving he feared the letter more than any other piece of evidence. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered panic, a window into who he truly was beneath the arrogance, a coward who believed destroying paper could destroy consequences. The courtroom buzzed with the news within minutes. Jurors would later say that no expert testimony could have condemned him more powerfully than his own desperate attempt to devour the truth. And if that self-destruction wasn't enough, the next twist shattered what little credibility his family still had, because the very people who claimed to believe in his innocence were about to commit a crime of their own, all in a final, disastrous attempt to save him. After Patrick's pathetic attempt to swallow his own confession, the courtroom believed his credibility had reached rock bottom. But what happened next proved that the arrogance running through his life didn't end with him. It infected the people closest to him. Desperate to salvage their son's collapsing image, the McVeigh family made a catastrophic decision that would not only fail, but permanently destroy any shred of sympathy the jury might have held. During the pretrial phase, Patrick's defense suddenly produced a printed email supposedly written by Ella herself, sent to a therapist, claiming she was depressed, overwhelmed, and contemplating harming herself. It was a narrative shift so manipulative and cruel that the courtroom froze when the defense suggested Ella may have taken her own life. But the moment the prosecution requested a 24-hour recess to authenticate the email, Patrick's carefully constructed lie began to unravel. Digital forensic teams traced the email not to Ella's devices, not to her accounts, not even to her location, but to a public library computer in a small town outside Philadelphia. And when the security footage from that hour was pulled, the image stunned everyone involved. It wasn't Patrick typing the message. It was his father, a man who had sat through every hearing looking broken, distraught, insisting his son was misunderstood, captured on camera forging a document designed to shift blame onto Ella, a woman his son had already taken from the world. The judge's anger was immediate and volcanic. He called it an assault on the integrity of the court, a deliberate attempt to mislead the justice system. Patrick's father was arrested outside the courtroom in full view of reporters, his wrists cuffed while his son watched with the same cold detachment he had shown since the beginning. And for the jury, this wasn't a family fighting for a loved one. It was a family willing to lie, forge, and deceive to protect a predator. But the fallout wasn't over yet, because the next blow wouldn't come from evidence or investigators. It would come from inside the courtroom itself, when someone Patrick expected to defend him finally broke under the weight of the truth and exposed the darkest secret he thought would stay buried forever. By the time Patrick's father was led away in handcuffs for forging evidence, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted from tense curiosity to a simmering disbelief at just how far this family was willing to go to protect a monster. But the most devastating blow, the one that shattered the last remaining facade around Patrick, came not from the prosecution, nor from a detective, but from someone who had spent her entire life living in his shadow. His older sister, K.H. Lowe. The defense, desperate and out of options, believed putting her on the stand would humanize Patrick, painting him as a troubled but misunderstood teen, loved deeply by his family and deserving of mercy. Instead, K.H. Lowe walked to the witness stand with trembling hands and hollow eyes, the weight of years of guilt crushing every step she took. She began by describing a seemingly normal childhood, the kind every suburban family claims to have: birthdays, school events, shared secrets. But as the questions grew sharper, her voice began to crack. She avoided looking at her brother, staring instead at the floor as she admitted she had known something was wrong long before Ella's murder. She had seen the lies, the manipulation, the sudden bursts of cruelty he displayed when he believed no one was watching. And then came the question that broke her completely. "Where was your brother the night Ella died?" K.H. Lowe froze, tears welling as the courtroom leaned into a silence so thick it felt suffocating. Finally, with a shaking voice, she whispered the truth she had carried alone. Patrick had come into her room late that night, smiling. He told her Ella was no longer a problem, and described the killing not with fear or panic, but with pride, relishing each detail as if recounting an accomplishment. K.H. Lowe's confession rang through the courtroom like a death bell, her sobs echoing as she apologized to Ella's family for not coming forward sooner. And in that moment, everyone saw Patrick the way K.H. Lowe had always seen him, not as a genius, not as a prodigy, but as a hollow, remorseless predator. But even this devastating testimony wasn't enough to quiet the storm inside him, because when the jury finally delivered their verdict, Patrick's reaction revealed a darkness so unfiltered, It shocked even the most hardened courtroom veterans. When K.H. Lowe's shattering testimony ended, the courtroom felt like it had been hollowed out by grief, disgust, and the heavy realization that the monster sitting at the defense table had not simply slipped through the cracks of society. He had been protected by them. The jury carried that weight into deliberation, but despite the mountain of evidence, the financial records, the soil samples, the encrypted documents, and the emotional collapse of his sister, they didn't take days or even hours. They were back in less than 60 minutes, a unanimous verdict written on their faces long before the foreperson read it aloud. As the words "guilty on all counts" echoed through the courtroom, the room braced for Patrick's reaction, not because they expected remorse, but because they had learned by now that any moment forcing him to face reality peeled away a little more of the facade he used to hide his emptiness. He didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't sag in defeat like most defendants hearing their life collapse in real time. Instead, he straightened in his chair, his expression shifting into a tight, unnatural smile, the kind a cornered animal wears when it wants you to believe it isn't afraid. His eyes moved across the courtroom, scanning for an audience, for someone, anyone, who might still see him as brilliant, misunderstood, powerful. When he met the eyes of the Martinez family, he didn't look away. He stared unblinking, as if daring them to acknowledge him one last time. And as deputies approached to escort him out, he muttered something under his breath, not loud enough to be fully heard, but clear enough that those closest caught fragments, words dripping with disdain, ego, and the delusional belief that even now, after everything, he still controlled the narrative. But the truth was undeniable. His story had been taken from him, piece by piece, by facts, by evidence, by the voices of the people he had harmed, and finally by the courtroom he believed he could manipulate. Yet the most terrifying glimpse into his true nature didn't come during the verdict. It came during sentencing. When Patrick finally spoke for himself and revealed a darkness so unfiltered, even seasoned officers admitted they had never seen anything like it. The sentencing hearing was supposed to be a formal conclusion, a final procedural step after the devastating guilty verdict. But the courtroom felt different that day, heavier, quieter, as if everyone present sensed the storm waiting beneath Patrick's skin. Victim impact statements came first, each one a painful reminder of the lives shattered by his choices. When Ella's father rose to speak, he didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't fall apart. Instead, he described a daughter who brought light into every room, who believed in people even when they didn't deserve it, who trusted Patrick because she believed goodness exists inside everyone. His voice cracked only once, when he said Ella died believing she had done something wrong. That sentence pierced the courtroom, drawing tears from strangers, reporters, even clerks. But at the defense table, Patrick didn't shift, didn't blink, didn't show a human response. Instead, he let out a slow, exaggerated yawn, a gesture so cold, so calculated, so cruel that for a moment, the entire courtroom froze in disbelief. It wasn't boredom, it was contempt. It was a final insult, a silent proclamation that he felt nothing for the family he destroyed. Security moved subtly closer. The judge's face drained of color, then flushed with rage. Even Patrick's attorney stared at him in horror. And yet Patrick's expression remained fixed in that smug calm he had worn since the beginning, as if he believed the entire proceeding existed for his entertainment. When the judge asked if he wished to speak before sentencing, the room held its breath. Patrick stood slowly, chains rattling, and instead of remorse, he unleashed a venomous outburst, mocking the system, taunting the families, declaring he would be remembered long after they were gone. It was the final unmasking, a public unveiling of the darkness everyone had felt but not yet seen so clearly. And just when the courtroom thought it had witnessed the full depth of his cruelty, Patrick's final moments before being taken away revealed something even more disturbing, an eruption of rage so violent that officers later described it as the closest they had ever come to staring into a human void. The moment the judge delivered the sentence, 2 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole, the courtroom exhaled, as if releasing a breath it had been holding for months. But Patrick didn't flinch. He didn't collapse or plead or show even the faintest spark of humanity. Instead, he rose slowly, a strange smile twisting across his face, the kind that made seasoned deputies shift their stance instinctively. The judge, exhausted from the emotional brutality of the trial, asked if he had anything further to say, hoping for silence, fearing the worst. And the worst is exactly what he got. Patrick leaned forward, eyes burning with a cold, electric fury, and unleashed a torrent of venom, screaming that none of this mattered, that he would outlive them all, that the families would never forget him, as if the destruction he caused were some sort of legacy he believed he deserved credit for. His voice cracked into a wild, unhinged laugh that echoed through the courtroom, sending an icy wave across the gallery. Deputies rushed to restrain him, but he fought like a cornered animal, thrashing, spitting, kicking, the chains clattering like metal punctuation marks to his madness. And then, in a final display of the true abyss inside him, he turned toward Ella's family and hurled threats so graphic, so hateful, that several people gasped and recoiled. What had begun as arrogance had devolved into a raw, violent rage, a last attempt to assert control over a world that no longer responded to his manipulations. Even his attorney stepped back, refusing to go near him. For officers who had spent decades witnessing humanity at its worst, the scene was unlike anything they had ever encountered, not because Patrick was violent, but because of the chilling emptiness behind that violence. It was the tantrum of a man who believed the universe had betrayed him by holding him accountable. It was the final confirmation that beneath the charm, the lies, and the polished intelligence was a hollow void desperate to be seen, even in disgrace. But while Patrick was dragged away screaming, the story didn't end there, because outside the courthouse, the people he hurt most stood in the sunlight, finally free from his shadow, and preparing to rebuild a life he tried so hard to destroy. When Patrick was finally dragged down the hallway, still cursing and fighting against the deputy's grip, the courtroom slowly began to empty, but the silence left behind felt strangely peaceful, a sharp contrast to the chaos he tried so desperately to unleash in his final moments. Outside the courthouse, the Martinez family stood together, their faces marked not by triumph but by a deep, exhausted sorrow. They weren't celebrating, they were surviving. For months they had sat through every hearing, every lie, every manipulation, forced to listen as Patrick twisted Ella's memory, mocked their grief, and treated justice as his personal stage. Yet now, as sunlight broke across the courthouse steps, they no longer had to see him, hear him, or endure the psychological violence he inflicted every time he opened his mouth. Reporters swarmed, eager for statements, but Ella's father raised a hand gently, not to silence them but to steady himself. He spoke slowly, not of revenge or punishment, but of Ella's kindness, her brilliance, and the future she was supposed to have. He made it clear that no sentence, no verdict, no dramatic courtroom outburst could restore what had been stolen. But justice, he said, at least ensured that Patrick would never have the chance to hurt another innocent soul again. Behind them, strangers, some who had followed the case from the beginning, offered quiet words of support. The city that once felt shaken by Ella's death now seemed united in honoring her life, refusing to let her be remembered only as a victim of Patrick's cruelty. Even officers who had worked the case for years admitted they felt a weight lift. They no longer had to fear the possibility of Patrick slipping through the cracks, charming a jury, or manipulating another system. Inside his prison cell, his voice, his rage, his theatrics would no longer echo beyond cold concrete walls. Outside, life, fragile, brave, persistent, continued for the people he tried to break. But even as the families walked away, believing closure had finally arrived, investigators were quietly preparing one final report, an analysis revealing just how close Patrick had come to escaping and how terrifyingly real his long-term plans truly were. In the days following the sentencing, while the public believed the case had reached its natural end, investigators continued piecing together the final sections of their forensic report, an exhaustive document that, once completed, chilled even those who thought they already understood the depths of Patrick's deception. They discovered that his plan to disappear after killing Ella wasn't some impulsive fantasy scribbled in a notebook. It was a nearly executed operation he had been constructing for more than a year. The more analysts dug into his laptop, the clearer the picture became. Patrick had researched countries with weak extradition treaties, created mock-up identities with different ages and nationalities, filled folders with instructions on laundering stolen funds into untraceable digital currency, and even drafted scripts he planned to use when introducing himself to potential landlords overseas. He studied how to blend in, how to speak less, how to adopt a soft accent that wouldn't draw attention. He'd looked up isolated hostels, remote towns, and ferry routes across borders where identification checks were minimal. Even more disturbing, he had saved screenshots of online communities where fugitives shared advice on how to disappear completely, commenting under fake accounts to ask about best practices. Analysts realized he wasn't just planning to run. He was preparing to erase himself, layer by layer. And had Ella not started noticing the missing funds when she did, had she confronted him even a week later than she intended, Patrick likely would have already vanished across an ocean, his new identity waiting for him like a doorway into a future built from stolen dreams and extinguished lives. The report concluded that he had been within days, possibly hours, of fleeing before his arrest. That narrow window between Ella's suspicions and her murder marked the final, terrifying truth. Her growing awareness accelerated his timeline. To Patrick, killing Ella wasn't the end of a partnership. It was a logistical step to avoid being exposed before he escaped. But investigators still had one final chapter to write, because buried deep in the analysis was a discovery so unsettling. It forced them to reconsider whether Patrick's trail of victims might stretch further back than anyone had dared to imagine. As investigators finalized their comprehensive report, a chilling realization began taking shape, one that unsettled even the most seasoned detectives who believed they had already seen Patrick at his worst. While reviewing the metadata attached to his encrypted documents, analysts uncovered timestamps and location markers that did not align with Ella's timeline or David's disappearance. Files predating both crimes contained references to other people, fragmented research notes, and early drafts of target evaluations that suggested Patrick had been experimenting with manipulation far earlier than anyone suspected. These weren't full-blown plans, but they showed a disturbing progression: trial-and-error attempts at controlling classmates, probing conversations designed to test emotional vulnerability, and even small financial scams he seemed to be practicing as early as age 15. None of these earlier individuals were harmed physically, but the patterns were unmistakable. Patrick had been refining the same techniques he later weaponized against Ella and David. Detectives found posts from old online forums where he posed hypothetical questions about removing obstacles and starting over with a new identity, long before he even met Ella. He talked to strangers about faking emergencies, creating alibis, and redirecting suspicion, not as someone curious, but as someone rehearsing. The deeper the investigators dug, the more they realized Patrick's crimes were not spontaneous eruptions of violence. They were the evolution of a mind that had been drifting toward predation for years, quietly learning what he could get away with and adjusting his behaviors accordingly. There was no smoking gun connecting him to additional victims, but the digital remnants suggested that if circumstances had aligned differently, if one early manipulation had escalated a little further, or if one potential target had been a little more isolated, Patrick might have acted long before Ella ever entered the picture. In the end, the report stated a haunting truth. They had caught him during the ascension of his violence, not at its peak. Had he successfully escaped, the pattern suggested he would have continued again and again. But even with this horrifying possibility laid bare, investigators still had one final task: visiting Ella's family to deliver the completed file, a moment that would force them to confront the emotional reality behind every calculated detail they had uncovered. When the final investigative report was complete, hundreds of pages detailing every lie, every manipulation, every calculated step Patrick took toward murder, the lead detectives knew there was one last responsibility they couldn't avoid: delivering the truth to Ella's family. It was a task no training could prepare them for. These were people who had already sat through every hearing, every graphic detail, every courtroom stunt Patrick used to taunt them. Yet the report contained truths even the trial had not fully captured: a deeper look into the monstrous design behind their daughter's final days. As the detectives walked up the small stone path to the Martinez home, the weight of that knowledge settled heavily on their shoulders. They were greeted not with anger or suspicion, but with a quiet grief that had aged Ella's parents in ways time alone could never explain. Inside, the air held that stillness found in homes that have endured too much pain to make room for anything else. The detectives explained the report carefully, gently: how Patrick had been planning an escape for months, how Ella had been days away from uncovering everything, how her kindness and trust had made her the perfect target for someone incapable of empathy. They showed the family the timeline of events leading up to her death, the digital evidence, the list of future potential victims, even the possibility, never confirmed but deeply suspected, that Patrick's violent trajectory might have begun long before Ella met him. Through it all, Ella's mother held her hands tightly together, as if holding on to something fragile that still connected her to her daughter. Her father, a man who had worked his entire life with his hands, stared down at the pages as if willing them to make sense. They asked no angry questions, demanded no explanations. They simply absorbed the truth with a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to the chaos Patrick had created. And when the detectives finally closed the folder, Ella's father whispered that knowing the full story didn't bring peace, but it did bring understanding. Yet even as the family processed the final answers, the world outside had begun forming a story of its own, because the media, now seizing every detail of Patrick's unraveling, was preparing to transform the case into a national warning about the terrifying power of a charming face hiding a predatory soul. As the final details of the case entered the public record, the media seized onto Patrick's story with a ferocity rarely seen in modern crime reporting. News anchors, journalists, and online commentators weren't just shocked by the brutality of his actions. They were terrified by how ordinary he had appeared before the mask fell off. Overnight, Patrick McVeigh became a symbol, not of teenage rebellion, not of privilege gone wrong, but of something far more unsettling: the idea that a predator can walk among us wearing the calmest smile, speaking the softest words, and offering the most convincing illusions. Documentaries dissected his behavior, true crime podcasts analyzed his manipulation tactics, and newspapers ran multi-page spreads comparing his planning to that of seasoned con artists twice his age. What disturbed the public most wasn't only the murder, it was the precision, the rehearsed empathy, the long-term planning for a life built entirely on stolen resources and discarded people. Parents wondered how someone so young could nurture such darkness. Psychologists debated whether he was born lacking empathy or had learned to bury it so deeply he could imitate it when needed. And all around the world, ordinary people recognized pieces of Patrick's persona in individuals they had once trusted: a coworker who always seemed too polished, a friend whose apologies felt rehearsed, a relative who manipulated with a smile. His story became a cultural warning, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it hides behind charm, waiting for an opportunity. Meanwhile, Ella's memory became the emotional center of every report. Her kindness contrasted so sharply with Patrick's calculating nature that she came to represent the countless people who trust too openly, love too fully, and never imagine the danger that could be taking notes behind a friendly face. Media outlets told her story not just to recount a tragedy, but to remind viewers of the very real cost of ignoring red flags simply because someone looks harmless. But even as the world turned the case into a cautionary tale, there remained one final chapter, because long after the cameras stopped rolling, investigators and psychologists were still trying to answer the question everyone feared most. Was Patrick an anomaly, or a sign of something far more common hiding in plain sight? Long after the courtroom emptied, long after Patrick's screams faded into the concrete walls of the prison where he will spend the rest of his life, the case continued to haunt everyone who touched it, not because of the brutality alone, but because of what it revealed about the darkness a single person can hide behind a flawless mask. Investigators who had worked homicides for decades admitted that Patrick unsettled them in a way few suspects ever had. He wasn't driven by desperation, rage, or impulse. He was driven by opportunity, ego, and an eerie ability to mimic humanity without ever feeling it. Psychologists who reviewed the case concluded that Patrick wasn't simply manipulative, he was adaptive, evolving his tactics as he learned what people wanted to see. The charm he used on Ella, the pity he sought from his parents, the arrogance he displayed in court, none of it was random. It was strategy, and that strategy forced experts to confront a chilling truth. Predators like Patrick don't always look like threats. Sometimes they look like the student who volunteers after school, the neighbor who helps carry groceries, the promising young entrepreneur whose ambition overshadows his empathy. Meanwhile, Ella's legacy became a quiet but powerful reminder of the fragility of trust. Her friends and family created scholarships, workshops, and community programs in her name, choosing to honor her not through fear, but through the kindness she carried in every part of her life. Her story, once overshadowed by Patrick's cruelty, became a symbol of resilience and love outlasting evil. But for many involved in the case, one question refused to fade. How many more Patricks exist in the world, masked, rehearsed, smiling, waiting for someone vulnerable enough to believe in them? That question haunted detectives, analysts, and viewers alike, because the scariest part of Patrick's story wasn't what he did, but how easily he convinced the world he couldn't possibly be capable of it. And so, even though this case is closed, one truth lingers like a warning in the dark: monsters rarely look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like the person you would never think to fear until it's far too late.